Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 4, episode 52. Last episode of the season, last episode of the year. I believe this marks the first season that I've done 52 episodes once a week for the entire year. A milestone of sorts. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. What's on tap for this final episode of the season? An autopsy of the University of Tennessee Volunteers football team, the highs, the lows, the trajectory of the program. Another week in the National Football League and another series of tragedies. It is really a poor product. If you're one of these streaming services paying an exorbitant amount of money to televise maybe 2 or 3 games a season, and you get the kind of duds that we saw on Christmas Day, that we saw on Thursday Night Football, how happy are you going to be 3 or 4 years into these deals? I wish all of my dear listeners a happy new year. The next time we talk, it will be in the year of our Lord, 2025. Thank you all for listening. If you're new to the podcast, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review, send to friends and enemies far and wide. If you like what you hear, This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. Please consider supporting.
Act 1, a postmortem on the Tennessee Volunteers football season.
Made the playoff, got their ass kicked by Ohio State. I could pretty much cut it right there. I've done that before. But no, dear listener, I'll go into detail. The University of Tennessee Volunteers made the expanded college football playoff in its inception year and were thoroughly throttled by the Ohio State Buckeyes in a very frigid Columbus, Ohio. I'm not going to turn this into a referendum on the college football playoff format. I've heard a number of people, and I agree with them, who have said that it's probably not fair to have these home games in the first round. It would be much fairer to both teams if you had a neutral site game. And I feel, in fairness, that's a valid point, but the logistics are very likely a nightmare. You don't want to have a number of different logistical issues about which teams are going to go where and when to these neutral sites. I guess you could turn many of the bowls that exist now that are not the marquee bowls that are going to be the sites for the second round of the playoffs, turn those into first round neutral site games. But then, as many of you more sophisticated college football aficionados understand, but some of you lay people do not, these are not affiliated with the NCAA in the sense that any league or the NCAA itself could just go to these bowl games and say, hey, you've got to take these 2 teams. You have to negotiate a fee. These bowls are an independent entity. So it's much easier logistically, financially, to seed these playoff teams and then say to a Tennessee, you have to go to Ohio State. To say to an SMU, you have to go to Penn State. It's the first year. They're still working through the kinks. We'll see how it all plays out. That's an excellent segue into the first year of the stewardship of the Tennessee Volunteers by one Nico Iamaleava. Considering the team only lost 2 games and went to the college football playoff, I think you have to qualify that stewardship as a success. But if you look at all of the opportunities missed, the 4 consecutive games in a row where the Tennessee Volunteers did not score a point in the first half of the football game, the number of passes that were just absolute wide open wide receivers down the field and nowhere near their intended target, the litany of bad reads. Watching the Tennessee offense in the year of our Lord 2024 could be a painful experience. And, as I stated before, this is a growing pain that Tennessee Volunteer fans need to accept because Nico is the starter. He's the future of Tennessee football. He's going to be the one who's going to have to experience those growing pains, and we're going along for that ride. I speculate that there were likely 77 points. This is 11 times that there was a wide receiver open down the field, and Nico just missed that wide receiver. 11 times, 12 times, 13 times. I'm not counting the extra point. I'm saying if you look at number 6, these are touchdowns that would have been put up on the board had Nico thrown a better ball. That probably happened between 11 and maybe 15 times over the course of this season. Having said that, he hit on a lot of long balls. He hit on a lot of long throws. He made difficult reads at times. He made difficult throws into tight windows at times. So the upside is there. A bittersweet end to the season of Dylan Sampson, the Tennessee running back, who had a great season, who rushed for over 1,500 yards, and unfortunately, because of what I believe is a hamstring injury, was unable to play but a few downs against Ohio State. Now, not to say that his presence in the offense would have changed the outcome. We're going to get to that. But it's just a bittersweet and unfortunate ending to a season where Sampson broke the all-time touchdown record at Tennessee. He had 23 touchdowns, rushing touchdowns. And if at the beginning of the season anyone asked what offensive records would be broken by this Tennessee offense, I don't think anyone would have said that it would be the rushing touchdown record by the running back. It would have definitely been more catered to or geared towards the passing attack in anticipation of what Nico Iamaleava was able to do. That passing attack, because of Iamaleava's inexperience and often because of an inconsistent offensive line, it did not produce anywhere close to what was expected, and yet that offensive line was able to turn around in very difficult circumstances, often in the same series where they had just blown an assignment on a passing play and push kids down and allow Sampson to run all over the place. Given the weather in the game against Ohio State, how cold it was a night game, I figured that Tennessee was going to lean on its rushing attack in order to keep that game competitive, mirroring what Michigan did to Ohio State in order to win their matchup, and it just never materialized. And let's get to the elephant in the room, and that's Tennessee's defense. A defense that statistically looked really good throughout the course of the season and kept that team in games where the Tennessee offense was completely ineffective in the first half. The Tennessee defense has 2 Achilles heels that most defenses do in college that play the style of defense that Tennessee has elected to play. The biggest Achilles heel is the fact that they're going to play man coverage. They're going to play man up. They're not going to play a zone. That means that the guy who's lining up against you at the line of scrimmage is the guy that's going to cover you no matter where you go down the field. And unfortunately, Tennessee's defensive backs, over the course of an entire football season, failed to understand the fundamental concept of you look up and back at the ball when you're running down the field against a wide receiver who's looking up and at the ball trying to catch it. A buddy of mine, a neighbor who has watched a number of Tennessee games with me, has heard me exclaim, "Look back at the ball," so many times. He has now become cognizant of the fact that Tennessee, playing man coverage, fails to look back at the ball. Their defensive backs just don't look at the ball when it's in the air. They're looking at the man, and they're flailing and flopping about in an attempt, not looking at the ball, to somehow impede the wide receiver's ability to catch that ball. Say what you will about him. We can refer to him as Nick Satan on this podcast if you'd like, but Nick Saban's Alabama defenses, in particular their defensive backs, played a lot of man coverage and were very adept. Even if they weren't at the beginning of the season, they learned over the course of the season that if you're going to effectively play that type of man coverage, you have to look up and back at the ball while the wide receiver is running down the field, particularly where you see the wide receiver start to look up at the ball. Georgia very effectively exploited that weakness in the Tennessee secondary, and Ohio State made it look like child's play to throw the ball down the field on the Tennessee defense because the wide receivers were just uncovered. Uncovered in the sense that the defensive back that was running stride for stride with that wide receiver simply didn't look back at the ball, had no awareness whatsoever of where that ball was, and they were able to catch the ball with a man right there. Silver lining, glass half full type approach is, hey, at least the defensive backs were stride for stride with their man. They weren't getting beat by 2, 3, 4 steps. It wasn't just wide open wide receivers running through the field. The Tennessee defenders were right there. They just failed to look back at the ball, had no awareness whatsoever of where it was, and therefore allowed the wide receiver to catch the ball anyway, making it more frustrating for a Tennessee fan because you're thinking, if you just look back at the ball, that's either an incomplete pass or an interception. That leads me to the second point of the Tennessee defense, in that it's been a spell since the Tennessee defense has had such a crop of linebackers. They have excellent linebackers, but because they like to play a lot of man coverage, they like to have a linebacker matched up against a tight end or running back. And again, Georgia took advantage of this, and Ohio State took great advantage of this. If you want to put a linebacker on our running backs, if you want to put a linebacker on some of our tight ends, we'll take that matchup every single play. And although they didn't get it every single play, in these passing situations where Tennessee is running this single man coverage, those linebackers were exposed in having to cover some of these faster tight ends, but namely these wide receiver type running backs. I mean, these kids who get the ball in the backfield, but if they lined up at wide receiver on every single play, they'd be just as capable, they'd be just as big a threat. Again, the defense statistically had one of its best years in the last 10 years and kept the University of Tennessee Volunteers in games where the offense was completely ineffective, particularly in the first half. But we also have to look at the last point here, and that's Tennessee's schedule in the 2024 season, which we're going to go over very quickly. Spoiler alert, the Vols' schedule this year wasn't as strong as many people expected it could be based on the teams that they played. In other words, many of the teams that they played were ranked at the time Tennessee played them, but over the course of this season, fell far out of the rankings and proved themselves not to be very good. Tennessee opens with Chattanooga at home, crushes them, and then goes to a neutral site to play NC State, a team at the time that was ranked. They crush NC State 51-10, but NC State goes on to demonstrate that they are just another middle-of-the-pack ACC team. They're not a standout, and they're not very good. They play Kent State at home. Then they go to Norman, Oklahoma to play the, at the time, 15th ranked Oklahoma Sooners. They win that game 25-15, and Oklahoma soon proves themselves not to be anything but a middle-of-the-pack SEC team. In what one can only call a letdown game, Tennessee goes to Arkansas and loses to an Arkansas team that is an up-and-coming team, but still a middle-of-the-pack SEC team, in a game where they started the trend of not scoring at all in the first half of the football game. They go home and play a Florida team where, again, they don't score in the first half. They are up by a touchdown, and Florida converts on, I believe, a 3rd and 23 or a 4th and 23 to tie the game at the end of the fourth quarter. Go into overtime, at least win in overtime. They play Alabama at home, and Alabama has one of its worst offensive performances of the season. Tennessee doesn't score in the first half against Alabama at home, and yet is able to prevail 24-17. No one would look at this Alabama team and say this is one of the strongest Alabama teams that has existed in the last 10 to 12 years. Tennessee then plays Kentucky at home, a Kentucky team that had their entire offense hurt. For the whole season, that Kentucky team fought, and it's a testament to their coach, Mark Stoops. They had several people on defense hurt, but their whole offense was hurt, and they never quit. Does Tennessee score in the first half against Kentucky? No, they don't. They eke out a win, and then they play bottom of the barrel in the SEC, Mississippi State at home. Thankfully, they do score in the first half, break that spell, leading up to the game against Georgia in Athens, where they lose 31-17, in a game where the Tennessee defense played very well enough for them to win, and the offense just couldn't support what the defense was doing. Tennessee then played UTEP, University of Texas El Paso at home, and then Vanderbilt in Nashville, winning both of those games, leading them to a 12-2 record and into the college football playoff. Not taking anything away from the team, they played the teams that were on their schedule, and they beat the teams that were on their schedule. But I do not anticipate that Tennessee is going to have such a favorable schedule next year, and I also don't anticipate that the Tennessee offense is going to shit the bed 4 straight games in a row and not score in the first half. But if they do, that will not be forgiven like it was in the 2024 season. I imagine teams will take advantage of this ineptitude, and that will increase the number of losses that the team experiences. So while I want to see a rise in the experience of Nico Iamaleava and his development and his growth, such that there won't be those types of lulls, if those happen again next year, I don't think we're going to see such a favorable outcome. Overall, I'm very pleased with the season, even though it was very frustrating. The talent is there. You're seeing the growth and development of a team that has the talent to win a national championship. They just haven't put it together yet. Did they have one of their worst games on defense against Ohio State? Yes, they did. Does Nico Iamaleava have a lot of growing up to do? Yes, he does. But is this not a team with its star on the rise, ascending versus descending? Yes, I believe it is. But for a terrible half of football against Arkansas on the road, Tennessee could have been one of the teams with a bye in the college football playoff. I see good things a-coming for the University of Tennessee volunteer football team.
Act 2. The reality is stark. The NFL sucks.
The Arizona Cardinals lost on the road to the Carolina Panthers. And yes, it's not easy to play on the road in an NFL venue, but you're playing the Carolina Panthers, who had won 2 football games previous to you playing them, and you're fighting for a playoff spot. Because there are players on this team that have professional pride, the Arizona Cardinals did make it interesting towards the end of the game, but too little too late. The Houston Texans play the Baltimore Ravens on Christmas Day, and for all intents and purposes, just shit the bed. The Pittsburgh Steelers, who by way of their record should be one of the more competitive teams in the AFC North, don't look that way against the Kansas City Chiefs. And then the debacle, the absolute shit show that was the Chicago Bears and the Seattle Seahawks. Did I watch this entire game? Of course I didn't. It was fucking 6-3. The score on the scoreboard was 6-3 when the game ended. That was it. The Bears fired their last coach because he was so inept at clock management, and then proceed with their new interim coach to demonstrate that that wasn't part of one individual's incompetence. That is a collective incompetence. That is incompetence on a massive scale. They proceed to shit the bed with clock management at the end of that game against Seattle. The decision-making, everything was just so comically incompetent. The reality is stark. I think you take these athletes and you give them the coaching staffs that existed in the NFL in the 80s, 90s, and the early aughts, and this would be the best football that had ever been played in the history of the National Football League. This is not a situation like in the NBA where the players are both disinterested and lazy. These players are playing hard. They just have idiots in charge of their teams, both the ownership and the management and the coaches. Both the owner, management, and coaches. Maybe I'm the fucking idiot. I wish I could say I did that on purpose, like it was a Chevy Chase skit where I'm saying, hey, point 1, this, and then point B, that. No, I just said both, and then I said 3 things. It's the last podcast of this season, of this year. I'm not editing any of this shit out. It's just too much of a pain in the ass. Let's refrain from discussing my incompetence as a producer of this podcast, and let's focus back on the incompetence of the National Football League. That being that there doesn't appear to be this new crop of coaches that is coming up that's able to lead these teams effectively such that you don't have this complete and total power imbalance where you've got a few experienced coaches in the league that are still leading their teams to wins, and the rest of the league is a bunch of have-nots. Every league wants parity. Every league wants there to be the possibility that a team that was bad the year prior could not only be successful the next year, but that could win it all. That increases the level of interest not only of each of the fan bases, but of the casual fan, the people that aren't necessarily going to watch the NFL week in, week out, or their particular team week in, week out. But because of the intrigue, they're going to casually start to watch as the season progresses. That's not what you have in the NFL in the year of our Lord 2024. You basically have 3 or 4 teams that are good. You have a bunch of teams that are what you would call between 6 and 8 and 8 and 6. And then you have this slew of teams that are like 2 and 10. Strangely, it's almost like Major League Baseball, where the teams that have are way ahead of all the teams that don't have. And you're watching all of these middle-of-the-pack teams in their buffoonery, their inconsistency being sold to us as drama and intrigue. It doesn't make for a very compelling product. Does anyone have any doubts that Kansas City is going to win the AFC? Sure, I think that they'll be challenged by Buffalo, but until I see Buffalo with more points than Kansas City has on the scoreboard at the end of the game, I'm not betting against Kansas City. And what about the NFC? Does anyone expect the NFC team this year to challenge the Kansas City Chiefs in the Super Bowl? And the way the Chiefs play, of course, it'll be close and it'll have intrigue only insofar as you think there's a possibility the NFC team is going to actually win the game, and then Kansas City pulls off some bullshit. There'll be some atrocious flags thrown. Wash, rinse, repeat. Now, the more astute of you, those that have listened to this podcast for a while, may say this is pretty much the same piece that you did a couple of weeks ago where you said that the verdict was in and the NFL sucked. Yes, it is. But I want to conclude on this note. The NFL, the NBA, all of these leagues are signing the most lucrative contracts for television rights that they've ever signed. And in doing so, what they've done is, smartly, if you're part of the league, this is a very adept, it's a very sound marketing strategy. You're now leveraging these new media entities against the old media entities. You've got these legacy broadcasters, CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, and now you're going to these streaming services and you're leveraging the money that they're willing to pay to broadcast these products against the old legacy, the money that they're willing to pay, the legacy media. And in the short term, brilliant. Brilliant. Because now you've got games that are being played on Netflix and games that are being played on Amazon Prime, and you're going to start to use more of this streaming leverage, not only against the legacy media, but because streaming services have a worldwide presence, you're going to be able to then try to market to a worldwide audience. The problem is such: if these streaming services only have a handful of games and are turning the games that they have into an event, and that event is a total fucking dud, such as, I don't know, let me see if I can come up with an example. Seattle at Chicago in the middle of winter, and the game is an absolute offensive farce, and the score at the end is 6-3, and you see the incompetence of the entire game displayed by one team's offensive drive at the end to tie the score by simply kicking a field goal. What's the long-term reach of that product? How compelling is that product such that you're going to be able to get that kind of money or more out of any of these entities in 10 years? And let's talk about the Donald Trump strategy for negotiating contracts. And I call it the Donald Trump strategy only because he vocalizes that he will do this, where most entities, most of these large corporations will do the same thing. They just never admit as much, and to the extent that they have to, try to put polished, professional face on what is nothing more than a turd. They're just cleaning up a turd. When a deal no longer works, they just stop abiding by it. If a contract is no longer favorable, if they're losing money in a contract, Donald Trump in particular, he just stops abiding by the terms of the contract. And if you're going to claim breach, okay, let's get into a lawsuit, because that lawsuit is then the forum to renegotiate the terms of the contract. If you see these streaming services in particular paying all of this money to the NFL to get a product like they did on Thursday night between the Seattle Seahawks and the Chicago Bears, and that's the only product they get. They've paid all of this money for just a handful of games, and the Houston Texans come out and get a safety, and that's all they can do over the course of an entire football game against the Baltimore Ravens. You would imagine that such a product is going to garner fewer and fewer views every year, which the numbers are already bearing out is the case. And there's going to be a stark realization that this product sucks. The NFL sucks, and we're paying an exorbitant amount of money to broadcast it, so much so that it's actually compromising the bottom line, our profit and loss for this entire organization, this entire entity, this entire company over the course of one fiscal year. And we're going to have to do something about that. It's not that there haven't been other eras where the NFL or any other professional league have quote unquote sucked. The product just hasn't been that great. It's that now there is more money being paid to these leagues than ever before just to broadcast this product. And if the product is terrible, there isn't any partnership leniency. This isn't some kumbaya situation where we've been partners for a number of years, for decades even, and we'll get them next season. No, the bottom line is the bottom line. Most of these corporations today, they would sell out anything that they could in order to make their quarterly profit so their stock price doesn't go down a nickel. And we think we're going to see these companies pay hundreds of millions of dollars to stream the Seattle Seahawks at the Chicago Bears, watching both of these incompetent offenses do nothing over the course of a 3.5-hour broadcast. If the product is no better than what we saw last night, there's going to be a reckoning, and right quick. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.